Your job is to drive them to a decision, really, and especially like in a corporate environment. I'm not always trying to get them to a yes. I'm trying to get them to a decision. Even if they say, you know what, this is really cool, but we're going to say no to this because we can't, whatever the prioritization, it doesn't fit.
How do you measure the impact of innovation? Every innovation has different timelines. It might be an innovation that has immediate impact. It also might be an innovation that takes generations to truly see the full impact. In my conversation with Jason Kerr, we talked about these different timelines of innovation and how organizations of all sizes measure the impact of innovation. What I've realized in this conversation with Jason is that yes, we can put metrics around success of innovation, but the art of innovation might be more important when measuring the impact. Some of the topics we cover in this conversation all have metrics, but those metrics might be completely different if the art of innovation was different. If someone had just made the decision to do this product placement or realized that the timing of an opportunity is now right, well, the metrics are probably a lot different. No measurement could have told you the right answer off the bat. Now, Jason is someone that encouraged and taught me a lot in my own first years of this type of innovation work. He's been all over the map in terms of innovation. He's worked with churches, with K-12 schools, with universities, with agencies, and most recently with Newell Brands, the company that owns brands like Elmer, Rubbermaid, and Sharpie. He's seen innovation done in so many different ways. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Jason Kerr.
Let's start out with the good. Has there been a moment where a problem has been solved so well by you or your team or just someone that you really admire that you're like, I'm going to remember that for the rest of my career, or something like that just really sticks out?
Such a good question. And part of why I love the journey that I've been on is I've been a part of so many different kinds of projects, from like really big, meaty system level things to products, small products, and everywhere in between. Um, there's been a few that are memorable, but the ones that have what I would say like the greatest impact or lasting potential impact. I did a bunch of work. It was probably about 10 years ago on uh, K-12 education and kind of the path from graduating high school to finding a job. And there was a whole bunch of different projects that all kind of happened together. And we were working with an organization in West Michigan that was really trying to put the pieces together, from businesses that knew that they needed really awesome, amazing, curious talent to succeed in the future. Schools that were like, look, we know that the system that we're a part of just isn't right. It's not the way it should be or could be. It hasn't changed over the course of the last 50 to 100 years. And then, government and nonprofit agencies that were like, we want to help, but we're really not sure. And all three of those kind of sectors work well on their own, but pulling them together was remarkable, right? And it took a team of people that was willing to say, we're going to try to do something different. We're going to use this thing. At the time, we are using the phrase human-centered design, right? We're gonna listen to students, like kids and their parents, and try to actually understand them. Because if we do that well, we believe we can design all the parts and pieces that we need to move forward. And so everybody had to learn together. Like the students had to learn, the parents, teachers, superintendents, business owners that had forgotten what it was like to be a kid, people in very different demographics, even in this little kind of bubble of West Michigan. But I'm really proud of that work. It launched a lot of different initiatives. It connected, more importantly, it connected a lot of people that would have never really been in the same room together. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, working with kids and understanding who they want to be and what barriers that they are seeing in their world is pretty remarkable, because that spins off all kinds of interesting things, new businesses and better connections and all that. So I think back to that work, that it's one that's really hard to measure, right? Because kind of got to wait for these kids to graduate high school and like get into 50 years from now, we'll know if it worked. But the mere fact that people are willing to have those conversations together and wrestle and learn together, that's what I'm proud of. And that wouldn't have happened without the process of design, really.
one of the things I think I forget sometimes is sometimes these like investments of things like right, the payoff isn't like a year from now or 2 years. It's like
Right.
30, 50 at the full lifetime, even past lifetimes,
Yeah.
even like, like full-time work at Yale, like the venture that, students start is probably not going to work. But the one after that, right? That's the chance. That's probably the better shot. The investment timelines are so different depending on what you're working on, but they're typically a lot longer than I think we all
Yeah.
want to give credit
Well, I
for.
think too, like that's the challenge with innovation in general, any kind of innovation, is that the new stuff, whatever it is, whether it's a new marker or a new car or a new educational system, um, very rarely, if ever, can you measure the new thing the way that you measure the things that exist. So if you're a business and you're expecting this brand new product to hit all the metrics, all the gross margin, all the uptake, all the store placement, all of the things that we expect a legacy product that's performed really, really well for a dozen years. It's very rare that one of those things is going to do that right away. And companies that aren't and organizations that aren't patient enough to like see what happens will pull the new thing when it doesn't hit right away. And all of a sudden you've missed an opportunity that if you just stuck it out just a little bit longer, you might have had something that would have been 10x of where your legacy product was. But it's fear and there's a lot of risk. And to your point, Matt, like you kind of have to wait. And humans, and especially in the macro environment we're in, we don't love that. We're not patient people necessarily. We're not part of patient organizations most of the time.
I was listening even to like a podcast earlier last week about books and how like most bestsellers actually they don't pop the first year. You
Right.
just have to like trust that it's going to work.
Right.
And that was like, ooh, okay, like that even like sets my own work of like, ooh, maybe I just need to give it at least a year. Because if these people that are like Atomic Habits, which is been the number one bestseller for so many years, it did like nothing the first year.
Right.
And it's like, well, he could have just killed it
Exactly.
and that would have been it. But yeah, so are you at that? All right, so maybe let's swing a little bit more negative then, and the things that might have like immediately you're like, ooh, this has no return. So, like, is there been a product or innovation you're like, "Ooh, I thought that was gonna be a home run," but then it, like, completely struck out even after a time?
I mean, any great anybody that works in the space has a laundry list of things that like I just really thought that would work and it didn't. Or ones that you knew should have worked and didn't because of kind of things outside of your control. But there was so I did a bunch of work with Elmer's, so the glue company. And so like 5 to 8 years ago, Elmer's was on a complete tear because this trend, this fad of slime was like taking over. And it went from a fad to like a true trend. And it became kind of like a phenomenon that was not time box. And so company was selling more glue than it knew how to make. And it was an amazing kind of run. And so naturally they were kind of like, hey, we would like more of this. So I was part of a team that worked on thinking of other ways that we could help people use glue in fun ways. And it was kind of targeted at kids. And so we came up with a suite of products that were activity based. So, and it was designed mostly for kids. So kind of 10 and under was sort of the target we were working with. But I'm a kid at heart. I have a lot of toys. So I was pretty confident it would like go beyond. Um, so we launched three products. One was called Elmer's Build It, which was a set of like screws and tools that you could use to put cardboard together. So extra cardboard, you could hook it together and make castles and forts and doll houses and all kinds of stuff. So that was one. And then we had a product called Elmer's Spray It, which was this weird, like kind of like food coloring graffiti thing that you could use on the driveway. You mix this stuff together and you could like paint lines. And so I was like, these things are awesome. Like they're super fun. It was during COVID, so everybody was really kind of. I mean, we ideated and created these virtually, which was also pretty cool. We had a retail partner that was really excited about it, but they just didn't sell at all. And so I was like, what is? was like so bummed because these were fun products. I was proud of the company for like taking a risk and trying something new. And uh, so I think there's a couple reasons that they didn't work. I think we brought them to market in a way that was kind of like disjointed. And the idea really was like you could go into Walmart or Target and there would be like an end cap of all of the fun things you could do with all of these things together. So like what if you combine slime with build it with, spray it. And they were merchandise like on the top shelf by the tape. And I was like, I have 5 kids. And like my kids are not gonna go to the tape aisle to find something fun. They're going to wander through the toy or maybe crafts. And so it was merchandise in a weird space. It was priced a little weird, and it wasn't like combined as an ecosystem. Um, and the company kind of expected each product to perform really really well. And our idea was like if you build a platform around all of these things, activity. We can't prescribe exactly what kids are going to do with these things, nor should we. And B, like we should just sort of let them experiment. On top of the fact, so we were running so fast on this. We worked with the supplier for the spray it bottle, and it just wasn't really good. It wasn't a good product. Like I used it on my own drive. I was like, this kind of sucks. But the idea was great, right? And it's kind of one of those that if I believe if we had walked it down to the next horizon, then just taken it just a little bit farther, it would have grown into a platform that was profitable, fun, brand building, all the things. But when you look at the numbers, you're kind of like, we just got to pull this thing right now. So that was a bummer. Like I was so excited. I'm a kid at heart, so I was like really excited for these fun products. But learning how a company, a retailer like Walmart or Target looks at the difference between art and craft and activity and toy, like those are all different spaces in the store. And we were trying to bring something that was kind of like in the middle of it. And they didn't know where to put it as a result. So nobody's fault, but it was like all of these different things came together to go, it just didn't hit. And I was like convinced it was going to be amazing. I still use them because they're fun.
Talking about like this ecosystem building of products, for corporations, right, that's a doable thing. But time is not. But then for startups, it's building the ecosystem off of that isn't. So I guess from your perspective, right, would you still have done the ecosystem part of it, or would it have been like, hey, let's do this more in a step by step? Because it sounds like the messaging by it, right, kind of got mixed,
Yeah.
building that ecosystem all at once too.
Well, and I think it's a good question because I've watched a lot of big companies, like very established, very well resourced companies, and you kind of present a roadmap and say, if we start here, we believe we can actually get here, and here's the 5 products or the 5 steps that we need to do to get there, and kind of the pacing. And maybe we have a thing that we want to make that's kind of far out, and so we need a little time to figure out how to actually make it. But to buy the permission to do that, launch these 3 really simple things, whatever they are. What I've watched a lot of big companies do is they see that, they get that idea, but then they just choose one. And all of a sudden, like it's like amnesia, and they forget about the whole thing. They forget about the whole plan, and then they've just chosen one slice of the platform. And you're like, well, it's never gonna work. It's not one thing. It's designed as a whole platform. Where I think startups a lot of the time are pretty good about showing where they want to go. I mean, to get investment rounds, you kind of have to show a plan, right? Where they struggle is the resources, focus, manpower to like march down the path. And yeah, sometimes we need to pivot every once in a while, but to stay true to it long enough to see the final version realize, that's where that patience thing comes in. So you've got impatience within big corporate companies, and they just take a slice because they think that one looks great, and you're like, it's not going to work because you didn't do all of these things. And then you've got the impatience on the startup side going, I see where I know where I want to go, but I literally don't have the time. I don't feel like I have the time, or I don't have the focus to get there, or I don't have the resources, whatever that looks like to get there. And so it's this, they're the same challenge. It's just different scale. It's kind of funny.
They both have different sets of problems, but at the same time, I feel like they have a lot of the similar
Yeah.
problems, which I think the last few years, I think I've really learned that part of it.
Yeah.
So I guess on that note, that's a good transition. So like, right, you've seen, we've already touched on like higher ed or education, corporate startups, right? You've seen a lot of these different places. So like, what are some trends that you see like of the hurdles of implementing these new ideas, or like, what are the mistakes people are making without even thinking about it? And you touched on to some of it, but I guess maybe just call
Yeah.
it out even like further.
I've been very fortunate to have some really crazy experiences in a lot of different kind of sectors. And sometimes at the same time, right? Like I remember teaching an innovation management class and I had the fire chief of our local community and a Fortune 500 CEO like in the class together. And they, the first couple sessions, they were like, we are a totally different playing fields. And 5 weeks in, they're like, oh yeah, our problems are the same. Like they're the same things. Most organizations, whatever, big, small, public, private, digital, consumer goods, whatever, what I see kind of a common element is it's cliche, but it's really true. They forget about people. They forget about whether it's the user or the person that's actually selling it. So the user and the chooser, they forget about their team. Honestly, one of the filters I always use with teams when they're generating ideas and we're trying to narrow down, yeah, you do desirability and feasibility and viability and all that kind of stuff. But then I always throw in like, hey, do you want to work on it? Like, does this sound interesting to you? We all have to work on stuff that we don't like, but it's really helpful if you can work on things that you resonate with. I think you get a better product a lot of the time. So they forget about the people involved. And, if you design for yourself, and expect somebody that's not like you to buy this thing or pay money for whatever the service is, like, and then you're surprised. Well, that's pretty confusing, right? Like that shouldn't be confusing because you're not the same people. And it's hard to design for somebody that's not you. You have to learn about them and get involved in the insights in their lives. The other thing, and I think the more dangerous systemic problem, a lot of companies and organizations seem to ask the question like, do we have an ideation problem or do we have a different problem? And very rarely do I think that companies have an ideation problem. Like it's actually not all that hard if you have the right inputs, if you've learned about people well, if you have good data, have smart people to generate a bunch of ideas. The challenge, the hardest part, and it's every sector is selecting. It's choosing the idea. Uh, it's prioritizing that choice and it's staying focused on the choice. And so um, we would often reference in the corporate environment that I was part of, like ideation or selection. Like we've got ideas, we've got every idea. Any product out there that our competitors are making, we had it on a sketch somewhere. We just didn't choose those ideas. We didn't select the ideas. Or if we did, we didn't stick with our selection long enough to bring it to market. Now, you can't select everything. That's why prioritization is a big part of it. And prioritization takes tough choices. It takes huge accountability. It takes discipline that a lot of companies are really struggling with because there's change and there's restructure and all this. And so when when companies don't recognize that, that's a big problem. When they recognize it, then they can start to build a structure around it. But it's often more about the selection and the prioritization than it is actually generating the new thing, whatever that thing is.
On that prioritization piece then. So when you're, looking at projects, maybe it probably might look different for different types of ventures where you're at, right? Like what would be the things that you're prioritizing off of? Like, is it just the goals? Like what are
Yeah.
like the assets or the attributes of what's actually helping you prioritize those?
It's different for every challenge. A lot of things sometimes um I think a lot of retail kind of focused companies will prioritize what the customer thinks. So the customer being the Walmarts, Amazons, Targets of the world, which is fine. That's a pretty dangerous game to start playing because at some point you're basically just making whatever they want, and they will eventually make what you have faster, cheaper, and ultimately better than you, and so they don't need you anymore. Um, I think that you know the other the other kind of place to challenge is like you're wrestling. Does this help build the brand? Right, whatever the brand is, does this buy us permission to get to a new space? Does it reaffirm the space we're already in? Does it let us experiment a bit more into a new place? Balancing what this new thing, whatever it is, means for the brand is actually pretty hard, because a lot of companies don't know their brands very well, right? They've gone through so much change. So you can't make a decision or prioritization, but you don't know what the brand stands for. That's one of my first questions when I go work with brand focused kind of products, is like, do you know what this is supposed to, like, who you are? Because if you know who you are, then we can make decisions at the end. If you don't, we're just going to kind of pick stuff and it might work. So the brand piece, and then it goes back to that roadmap. I often will really challenge teams, like, if you really want to build this fine thing over here and you don't know how, like, what are the choices you can make? What are the products you can launch? What are the partnerships you can form? Whatever it is that buys you the time, the money, the learning to get you to the final thing. It's not maybe the perfect product, and it's a short term journey, but it's part of the journey. So you might just need time to figure out the new material that you're going to make this thing from, or it's still in its infancy from a technology standpoint. Fine, then do the easy thing right now to start to teach your consumers what you want them to actually get into later on, whatever it is, right? Um, iPod Touch is a great example, right? Not to harp on Apple, but like, that was an interim kind of product, right? It wasn't meant to stay around very long. It was to help people get used to touchscreens. It was to transition people from their traditional iPod experience to using it as a phone. It was kind of like this weird little baby step, and it served its purpose, right? It generated revenue and was probably relatively successful, but it wasn't like a long term strategy. It was like a little slice. So those are the things, you kind of want to prioritize against the baby, like the base foundations. Like, do people want to buy it? Do we think we can actually make money with it? And is it actually possible to be made? So those are pretty cliche, but those are good filters to use as you prioritize.
I guess this whole, set of questions that we've been talking about, right, is it's all about the people side of things. And right, you talked about like who's actually building it, then it's actually people that are actually using this or getting the services off of it. And I think from like when we first started when we first met, you talked a lot about empathy, and
Mhm.
then you had this really cool TEDx talk on empathy in everyday life. And then you talked about like TSA and then buying a car and like how these experiences just like really just suck. But I don't think they've changed,
No, they haven't.
even though
That was what, like 8 years ago that I did that
yeah,
talk.
8 years ago.
TSA is still pretty bad. I mean, they've tried some things, but it's not consistent. Like, it's very dependent on whatever airport you're in, and very dependent on the person you get, on how that's, I would argue they focus a lot on, like, the experience of the passenger, which is great, but they kind of forgot about the experience of the agent, now that their life is a mess and they're overworked and and nobody likes them, right? So they got some of the stakeholder things together, but they forgot about, like, the employee, which is kind of important. I will say, buying a car. So it's funny, when I did that talk, I was in the process of buying a car. I just went through that process again, buying a different car. It's still horrible. Like, I don't understand why it's so bad. Like, the CRM systems, like, the number of emails I get from dealerships, like, that don't it's like there's no intelligence to it. And I know we have the tools. It's like, I'm not a huge AI fan, but I feel like AI could help fix some of this. Um, I don't know. It's just so weird. Anytime you see, I think Amazon and Nissan just did a trial where you could, like, prime buy a car and it'll show up. I kind of like that idea, because the rest of the ecosystem around it just stinks. And I don't totally know how to fix it, but I know it shouldn't be like it is. And I'm so surprised that it hasn't. Any of those new trials, like Carvana or any of those, like, they just never quite get there. And I'm like, oh, but they're onto the right idea. But there's a lot of other forces kind of counteracting that. So TSA would be great if we could focus on the agents. buying a car just, I feel like, stinks for everybody involved, whether it's, financing to the actual dealership and the end user and the manufacturer. Like, nobody seems really happy in that. So feels like we could fix that. Yeah, there's a lot of like kind of experiences if you just maybe just talk to people a little bit. Healthcare, right, is one that has tried really hard to get around that, but all of those flows of information are so complicated. Um, and nobody's happy. Nobody's happy in that situation. You talk to a doctor, they're not happy. You talk to the front desk people, they're not happy. Patients aren't happy. Their families aren't happy. Has to be better.
I have zero answers because
Thanks.
I just bought a car too like a year
Yeah.
ago, and I was so confused by the whole
Yeah.
experience. Because it was like I was like, I'm the one like spending the money, but I'm expected to do stuff for
Right.
you. And I was like,
Yeah.
this is so weird.
And then just to get like a response back on something. So I'm trying to give you money. Like,
Yeah,
don't you want
right.
the money? Like, why is this hard?
So on that note, I think one of the things that I appreciate about you is you have a lot of different frameworks
Mm,
and a lot of different ways of actually like structuring right all like you mentioned stakeholders and everything about that. Like if you what are like some of those frameworks you might apply to some of these like really frustrating like or I guess what frameworks would you start with to start like really mapping some of that
yeah.
out?
I mean, there's kind of like three core things from a tool standpoint that I always go back to because they work in pretty much any situation. Like, at some point in time, preferably sooner rather than later, as you start a process, whatever the problem or opportunity that you're trying to pursue, doing some level of stakeholder map is where you got to start, because guaranteed, 100% guarantee, you think you know all the people involved in some system, but you don't actually know everybody. You're not close to everybody, and so you might have really good understanding. Let's use TSA for a second. Like, if you were chartered to say fix lower airport check-in frustration from 1,000,000% to 1,000%, and the check-in time, lower that now, and you work for TSA, you probably would go, well, we know our passengers really well, but we don't actually know what our agents want. And so kind of identifying who you're close to or who you have a lot of assumptions about is really, really important, kind of following that map. And it's never really a done thing. It's a very dynamic exercise. And that's the other piece I always recommend for teams on the front end of projects is your stakeholder map should evolve over time. Like, it's never like ready to hit print. It's that you're always learning something, you're always kind of going back. There's iteration that has to happen. I think that's a big piece of it. And then, following, there's lots of different ways to do journey mapping, 5Es and other things like that, but following the start to the end of any use case is pretty important. And doing that, where I see the magic always happen, is it's not just you can see each stage of it, but it's getting from one stage to the next, that transition point. That's where big established companies kind of fall apart, is they do these silo things really, really well, but they don't talk to each other. And so the experience for the consumer is disjointed, right? Like, it should be better because they have like best in class capabilities, but they're not connected together. So those are things to kind of poke at. And like I said too, if you don't know who you are, you don't know your brand. It's cliche, but if like you don't know your why or you don't know what you're trying to stand for, every idea sticks, right? Every idea seems to work. Everybody's the consumer. Well, you gotta start to narrow down a little bit if you're going to be choiceful. It's a happy accident then if other people than you assumed would use your thing. Yeah, then you get this viral, wonderful sensation. But you still have to be choiceful with who it is, and you have to make sure you understand who you don't know yet, and then learn about their life. The one thing with that is people will start to throw in like focus groups and stuff like that. Um, those are I see those being used way too often on the front end of a process. They're not good at that. They're not meant for that. They're meant to refine. They're meant to be a convergence, and a refinement process at the end of kind of a journey. They're not meant to explore. and to be curious. You have to use different research tools, different ways to get to know those people. So I think there's decisions being made on the wrong kind of data at the wrong time so often, whether it's a small startup or multi-billion-dollar company. It happens a lot.
The brand piece, I think, right, that you kept going to, I think reminded me, which is a little bit time, even it's a little bit different, but I think the Detroit Lions, right,
All right.
unfortunately just lost, but like, right, like they have an identity and they continually go after that.
Yep.
And I think the brands, right, it's the same concept. And I think the other piece, right, that like a lot of creators I think we'll talk about is like every piece of content you do, you need to be ready for that to go viral.
Yeah.
And that's the person you work with because like, and that's the interesting piece that I think is right. It needs to be continually after that person you want to be
Yeah.
working with rather than like, I just want views. I just want everyone because like everyone is no one. And you gotta, really identify like, here's who we are and here's who we work with.
Yeah.
And if you don't have any of that, then the rest of it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think the interest of worked with a lot of like very legacy established brands, billion-dollar brands that have worked for 40 or 50 years to become who they are. And they stand for something. There's a lot of trust, a lot of investment to get there. The interesting thing is, as those brands get more mature, their orthodoxies get more embedded, and so it gets harder and harder to do the new, and they get more and more risk adverse because they're so focused on like protecting this brand. I would argue that most of those brands that have been around for so long have a ton of permission to play because they're a household name and they're embedded. People know what that means. What else could they do is what they're asking about. But it's really hard to pitch that to these folks that are stewarding this precious brand, which is important. Like you got to protect it. Like it's taken a long time, a lot of money, and a lot of effort to get there. But it's this funny like continuum where you're like, because you're heritage and because you're well known, you can actually do all kinds of new things. People give you way more permission to experiment and do silly things than you yourself as the brand steward would believe, it's just some weird irony.
One of my like weird, like when I have free time, like little, like if I have 5-10 minutes, I'll just like start Googling like the products that failed.
Yeah.
And it's usually all the big brands. And it's like so fascinating
Yeah.
to see all that and their brands are good.
Yeah.
So I agree with you on that piece.
Well, I'll give you one anecdote here. I won't go into exactly what this was because it's not launched yet, but I was part of a project not that long ago, a couple months ago. We got curious. We saw financial opportunity in a particular market, and we knew that our products with the particular business unit that I was working with would be good there. And we had a retail partner who was like curious with us. And so we spent a lot of time getting to know this consumer, which is a different consumer than anybody that we had worked with. And our filter set was, can we use what we already make with minor adaptations to it to become more relevant and useful to this new consumer market, this new space for us? Answer is yes. Well, we had this great ideation workshop, really, really good cross-functional partnership, great empathy building out in the field with these folks, like building prototypes and showing them is like case study of how you would want some of this stuff to go. Good vibe in the room. On the last day, one of the brand management people comes in like in a panic and was like, they held up this catalog, and I think it was from 1998. And it was the previous products that this company had made. All of the stuff that we had just sketched up was in there. And we hadn't made it. So we had already made all of this stuff. Like verbatim. For the same market. And the company had chosen to exit it at whatever point. So last, 20, 30 years, they chosen to exit it. And now we were trying to like repropose to get back into the same space with a very similar product set. And there was this interesting moment in the room because half the people were like, we should just walk away. We tried this already. We should walk away. I was like, no, hold on. This is a different time. Like the ecosystem around this is different. The numbers around this are different. The consumers are very different. There is an emerging trend that supports it. And they made a good choice back in, in the 90s to say, we're going to walk away from this for right now because they didn't see it. But now we're seeing it again. So we shouldn't be ashamed of trying to bring back this thinking. And are the products going to be better? And of course, but it was just kind of this interesting moment. It's like, oh no, like we already did this. I think mature companies can hit pause and go, okay, has the world changed enough that we should re-engage with this? And the immature leaders and the immature companies will go, oh, we've already tried this. We can't. It's worthless. Well, you tried it 30 years ago. Like that's a long time. Just think about the last 4 years, totally different world that we're in. So those things don't be afraid of the things that look kind of familiar. If you can relearn the people, they might be very new and very relevant in a different way.
Totally. I think even like pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, life is so
Right.
different. Like the last 4 years, like it's
Right.
so much different.
Right.
But on that note, I guess, is there anything that we missed that you're like, ooh, I just thought about this, or like, where can people like learn more about you?
A lot of people think the kind of work that I do is super fun because it is. It's super fun. There's a variety that not everybody's built for. To be able to shift between brands and products repeatedly is tough. Like it is kind of draining. And they're innovators, whatever role you play, whether you're internal or external or kind of an advisor, wherever you find yourself, it takes a bit of a buoyancy almost. Like you've got to be resilient in a way that you can kind of always sort of show that there's something there is a possibility, there is an opportunity, because your job is to drive them to a decision, really, and especially like in a corporate environment. I'm not always trying to get them to a yes. I'm trying to get them to a decision. Even if they say, you know what, this is really cool, but we're going to say no to this because we can't, whatever the prioritization, it doesn't fit. Cool. I'm great with that, right? Like I'm really actually very good with that. It's where you get into the indecision. That's tricky. Um, a lot of people ask, like, how do I get to do what you do? And I think there's a lot of, you can take classes and programs and there's tons of books that you can read. The reality is a great person that hangs out in the space is super curious. And I, for a long time, didn't realize that I was a natural synthesizer. Like it was very easy for me to see three different things and put them together and go, oh, here's what you can do. I thought everybody could do that. And not everybody is good at that. Not everybody should be good at that. I'm really bad at a lot of things. I'm good at that part. And that's always kind of like if you're curious, if you're really good at um, analogous thinking, like if you can see this thing in a completely different business and start to see how those things relate or what you could learn from them, those are like good clues that you might be really good at this work. I didn't go to school for this. I have a psychology and religion degree from a small liberal arts school, um, which was a very scary experience because I didn't know what I was going to do when I graduated. And I've done lots of different things, but I think it makes me better at my job now because I had all these crazy experiences. I've gotten to work with all these different people all over the world. And, somebody that just has one small point of context isn't going to be able to see and make the connections that you need to think of the new thing, whatever that thing is.
Very similar experience. Didn't do religion and psychology, but studied chemistry and heavy used it. So I understand.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for being
Yeah.
on. Thanks for doing this, Jay. I think there's a lot of good insights.
Yeah.
So thanks for doing this.
So that's my conversation with Jason. If you enjoyed it, let me know by subscribing to the station email newsletter. You can subscribe right in the description. I promise I won't spam you, and I'll reply right back to you if you email me there. I send the newest episodes through the newsletter, plus additional resources each week. Thanks for watching and listening.